thank you all for being here. And given our two guests, I know we're going to have a pretty potent and engaging hour, pretty much half of which will be dedicated to answering your questions. Um, George Monbiot, joining us from London, is an award-winning author and journalist, most notably of late for The Guardian. Um, George has been dedicated to environmental research and worldwide activism, as well as to creative efforts toward community building and civic engagement. He's innately connected to communities on the cutting edge of new ideas around governance, of the politics of belonging, and of environmental stewardship. George has received awards, among them the 2022 Orwell Prize for Journalism. Peter Hutchison is a critically acclaimed filmmaker, New York Times bestselling author, educator, activist, and filmmaker. Based in Brooklyn, New York, his experience in film and television production as documentary director and producer and writer and NYU faculty member spans nearly 2 decades. Recent films have included Requiem for the American Dream, featuring Noam Chomsky, The Cure for Hate, subtitled Bearing Witness to Auschwitz, Devil Put the Coal in the Ground, and Healing from Hate. Together, this team wrote The Invisible Doctrine, The Secret History of Neoliberalism, with Lucas Sabian, and they produced the film by the same name, which was recently named one of the best and most anticipated documentaries of the year by Vogue magazine. And it's number one on the Times UK bestseller list. The book is. So we have both the book and the film, same title. And in fact, the film came first, then the book. To start, George, you have described neoliberalism as capitalism on steroids. Can you tell us why?
Well, neoliberalism is a tool used by capital to solve its biggest problem, which is democracy. Because when people get the vote, they start demanding outrageous things like fair wages and shorter working hours and not having their arms ripped off by machinery and decent housing and public services and things like this. And capital doesn't like that very much. So it's tried various means of solving this problem, and fascism was quite effective until 1945 when it ran into certain difficulties. But just in the nick of time, really, two books were published in 1944, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek and Bureaucracy by Ludwig von Mises, sketching out a new program which would be very handy to capital indeed. And that wasn't really their intention. They genuinely seemed to believe that any intervention in the social order by the state would lead inexorably to totalitarianism. That was the fundamental argument, and that we should not really be making our decisions through politics. We should be making them through economics, through buying and selling stuff. But the reality is that that meant that those with the economic power got to make the decisions. Public services should be privatized. Taxes on the rich should be radically cut. Regulations should be removed. Trade unions and protesters should be curtailed. Effectively, politics and democracy should be pushed out of the way in favor of what they called market mechanisms. And this would enable a kind of natural order to be established. You could tell who the worthy people were because they had the money. You could tell who the unworthy people are because they live in poverty. And if the government tries to interfere with that, then the unworthy people might come out on top and the worthy people might be cast down. This was the essence of neoliberalism, a belief that there was a kind of Darwinian order, that and that reflected virtue. It was quite a Calvinist belief, and that the job of government was to get out of the way. And when it was launched, and so it was really formalized in 1944, it was widely seen as an utterly repulsive doctrine. It wasn't at all what people wanted. They wanted a state which was going to to help to ensure that no one fell through the cracks, to provide a strong public services, to protect people from harm. And that was very much the prevailing doctrine at the time. But the neoliberals received huge amounts of funding from some of the richest people and corporations in the world and built a kind of international network of think tanks, of academic departments, of government advisors, of journalists who managed over the course of about 30 years to convince people that this was the only way to run society. You're on mute, Annie.
Peter, you have a long list of activism-centered films under your belt. How did this project come about?
Oh, it's interesting. I had made a film with Noam Chomsky about a decade ago called Requiem for the American Dream, and it was about inequality in the United States. And Noam spoke a lot about neoliberalism, and at the time, I felt like I had a pretty decent understanding of it. But once I started to dig, I realized how insidious, how pervasive, um, how much of an impact it had on our lives and our society. And I really wanted to, I felt the need to really learn more about it. And I'd wanted to explore this through film, but I hadn't found the right vehicle yet. Um, and then I stumbled across George's piece in The Guardian from 2016 that absolutely floored me. It was this eloquent, efficient, direct, easy to understand primer on neoliberalism. And I instantly was like, this is what I've been looking for years. No one is talking about neoliberalism this way. No one's explaining it the way George is. I, I gotta reach out to this guy and see if he'd be willing to collaborate on a project. Um, and so I dropped him a line, and pretty quickly he said yes. And so here we are. Oh, you're on mute again, Annie.
You'd think I'd have this figured out. Anyway, film first, then book. Just a quick look at that.
Yeah, well, yes, film first, but the book was out first. And now we have the film. Um, Films tend to take a lot longer to make than books. But we had collaborated on a loose transcript for the film itself, which isn't an interview at all. It was basically a collaborative sort of loose script that George he kind of blew me away. He basically was able to perform to camera. I mean, I cued him a few times, and we structured all the language and the content together, which was really fun. I mean, it was one of the I have to say it was one of the easiest and most satisfying writing experiences of my life, both the film and the book. George is so easy to work with, and he's so brilliant. And we somehow found a way to work very quickly together. Um, so we created this loose script that he essentially just performed to camera over the course of a couple days. Um, and we were in the edit room very early on with the initial transcript and the footage, and I was thinking, "Well, this would make a great book, you know. It's all, the structure is there, the template's in place, um, and uh, I think we both had this idea of having a very slim volume akin to Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny that, you could, you know, almost like old school political pamphleteering that you could put in your pocket and pass along to the next person. And, would be point of purchase sale at a bookstore when you walk up to the cash register. Um, and so we pitched it around, and Penguin jumped on it, but they very quickly said, well, listen, transcript's only 9,000 words. We need at least 25,000. And George and I reluctantly said, okay, well, I guess we have to get to work. And before we knew it, a month later, we had a 35,000 word transcript. So much for the slim volume, like on tyranny. But I think it's a really efficient book, I think, in terms of information. I'm really pleased with the way it's structured. I think it reads really quickly. I like the fact that it's sort of divided into these chunks that you can kind of read one at a time and download and sit with them. Um, I feel like it's ideal bathroom reading, right? You can just kind of you leave it in there and leave it there and get to it, or bedside reading, right?
Yeah, you
Um,
promised no indigestion. Um, I want to say, and George pointed this out, of course, that the book followed the structure of the film, which is these wonderful bites, and you can dial right in and really get the pithy material, without having to engage in a long, and a lot of text. You can get it right away, and so I'm very grateful for the way the book mirrors the film. Um, uh, right now we're in a time that we don't even have to articulate what it feels like right now. But of course, when the Windham World Affairs Council scheduled you guys, we didn't know that we would be in this time.
Uh,
Happily, we're doing this.
nor did we when we wrote the book or made the film. So
Right. But it was sort of prescient, I guess. And so here we are. So would one of you, or ideally both of you, speak to the relevance of this work here and now?
Shall I start on that, Peter?
sure,
Okay.
there's plenty plenty to
Yeah,
talk about. So
no, for sure. Yeah. So, so one of the things that neoliberalism does is to disenchant people with politics. When it says the state is not here to solve your problems, the state is not here to do anything for you, really, not here to give anything to you, not here to distribute wealth from the rich to the poor, not to provide public services except the barest possible minimum. All that's left is the state as an authoritarian, coercive entity, that everything else gets stripped away. And when that doctrine becomes universalized, when it becomes hegemonic, when both Republicans and Democrats broadly adopt the same doctrine, when in the UK both Conservatives and Labour broadly adopt the same doctrine, people give up on conventional politics. They say it's just the yabber of a remote elite. It's going on above our heads. They're not talking to us. They don't care about us. They're not engaged with us. Why should we bother? And then some colourful, noisy, a loud person comes along and says, "Hey, I stand outside all of this. I'm on your side. I'm against those political elites. I have nothing to do with them. I will sweep away the corruption. I'll sweep away the capture of politics by money. So trust in me." And people say, "Well, we might as well give him a go. Why not? Why not when everybody else has failed us?" That's been the prevailing sentiment in so many countries around the world. Of course, when these killer clowns do get into office, we see that they double down on all the things that neoliberalism has done. Political corruption comes to the fore. It becomes far more potent than it was before. And we very quickly see them sweeping away political norms to anoint themselves emperors. And this, sadly, is what Donald Trump has done, exploiting 40 years of political failure in the UK to establish what is beginning to look like a dictatorship.
yeah, and I think to just to add to that, I mean, what we're seeing is the deconstruction of the administrative state right in front of our eyes every day, right? Every single time you turn on the news, every single time you read a paper, there's another example of the the deconstruction of the administrative state and what comes with that, all that comes with that. Um, the complete corrosion of public trust in institutions. Um, there's no better way than to have a program fail than to rip its heart out and defund it. Um, then you can prove that it didn't work anyway, and you've got it, and then you can privatize it, and you can have one of your buddies take it over, and make billions of dollars off of the privatization of whatever it is, public services, healthcare, you name it. And we see entire departments being ripped apart from the inside right now in the United States, whether it's you know, the DEA or the Department of Education. We see the Veterans Administration being eviscerated. These things are going to either disappear, and all of that money is going to be rerouted towards tax cuts to the billionaires, or we're going to see a lot of those services privatized, and those same very wealthy people will take those will benefit from that in a different way, right? And there's what's interesting to me is that at the time of making the film and writing the book, we felt we kind of had to go out of the way to explain like what an oligarch is. Um, and because it really wasn't sort of commonly understood in conversation. And yet now I hear the term 100 times a day, at least, right? So it's crazy to me to see how far we've come in these few short months since George and I collaborated on the book and the film. A lot of these things, it's a great little, you know, I love using the term capitalism on steroids, but what we're really seeing how fast all of this is accelerating right now. And that is what neoliberalism does.
Uh, Excellent. I want to take a quick housekeeping reminder here. I want to give a reminder, please. I see some really cool stuff coming into the chat, but I won't be looking there for the questions during the Q&A. So could you just move the question that you put in the chat, can you move it over to the Q&A? There are like 25 in the chat. So that would be very, very helpful. So if you guys could talk a little bit about what I actually found very heartening, the notion of the politics of belonging, and this may segue into a way forward, but it's a wonderful notion. I'm looking more at the idea of the commons as well, but that politics of belonging uh, sheds a little ray of light for me.
So a few years ago, I conducted a small exercise, which was to name my values, and I think it's a very good thing for everyone to name their values, not least because we're constantly told what our values are by the dominant political ethos, and we're told that those values are selfishness and greed. Human beings are fundamentally selfish and greedy. Actually, we're not, and there's a huge range of evidence from social psychology, from anthropology, from neuroscience, from other social sciences, showing that actually we all have a little bit of selfishness and greed in us, but primarily our values are things like community and family and kindness and empathy and wanting a good life for everyone, not just for ourselves. There's about 1% of the population whose primary values are selfishness and greed, and we call them psychopaths. And sadly, they tend to be in charge. We are by and large a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. But that exercise was very useful because having written down all my values, I said, which of these values appeal to everyone right across the political spectrum? And the one that really leapt out at me was belonging. Everyone has a fundamental need to belong, to feel that they are part of something bigger than themselves. And while left and right might think of different forms of belonging, that urge to belong is something that we can work on and appeal to almost everyone with if we get it right. Now, on the far right, they've been very successful in appealing particularly to lonely, alienated young men, and to say, look, you've been left on your own. Everyone says bad things about you. You're isolated. You can't get a girlfriend. Hey, come and belong to something. We can give you something to belong to, where you can belong to something where there's a whole load of young men who look just like you, who might wear the same uniform and shout the same slogans and give the same salutes. This is how fascism operates. It appeals to people. It attracts people who are desperate for belonging. And unless we can provide an inclusive form of belonging, a completely different form of belonging, a neighborhood belonging to which everyone who lives locally, even only temporarily, can feel that they are part of that community, unless we open our arms to people, then we're always going to lose to the far right. And so Peter and I sort of hatched this politics of belonging, say, we build political community from the neighborhood level upwards, using a whole load of new tools, including the commons, and you've mentioned them already. The economic commons is crucial, but also the political commons. Participatory and deliberative democracy, absolutely crucial tools for enabling people to belong to politics and politics to belong to them day by day, not just once every 4 years. And we feel that this can become the new locus of political organizing, and lead a way out of this terrible morass that we're in.
Anything to add to that, Peter? I mean, I also think about, your work in West Virginia and the folks you encountered down there and stuff. Would you want to add anything to that about the politics of belonging?
Yeah, it's interesting. You asked me earlier, actually, how does my work fit together? And at the time, you may not really realize how these different pieces are linked. But I've done a series of films on violent extremist groups in the United States, people involved in white supremacist organizations. Um, and I was taking a look at this behavior and these needs through this lens of masculinity. Um, but it's really about belonging, exactly like George is talking about, like, uh, this is how fascism starts. This need for belonging it's, we all have it. We're hardwired as human beings to need to belong. And what neoliberalism does is it isolates us from one another. It silos us. It makes us feel more lonely, um, more isolated, and as a result, much more vulnerable to uh, the call of these sorts of organizations. It's a very primal, primitive need that can be quite easily taken advantage of and exploited. Um, and so I don't think I really realized it entirely at the time that those films, the series of films I made, Cure for Hate, Healing from Hate, um, were intrinsically interconnected to neoliberalism and the impact of neoliberalism. Um, and I think you mentioned Devil Put the Coal in the Ground. You know, I mean, it's really an exploration of extractive capitalism, right? And its impact on people and their culture, um, and their traditions. And it's a devastating look at what happens when people are seen as just as resources to be used up and discarded, just like our environmental resources are seen as simply being resources to be used up and exploited. And we talk about that in Invisible Doctrine as well. And it's how we explain the roots of capitalism and what capitalism is, you know. Um, so so yeah, I think these things are very much linked. And and that makes sense because it impacts all of us in ways that we're not even aware, which is why I think George and I felt so strongly about the need to write this book. You got to start with an understanding of how you got there. And I don't think, I think it's a very common feeling, perhaps now more than ever, that a lot of us are, we're feeling lost. We're feeling isolated. We're looking, particularly in the United States, where, a lot of us are looking for, you know, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we organize? Where are my people? How do we, you know, how do we make any kind of dent in what's happening right now? And I think our book is a starting point. And I also think that it provides some really hopeful solution-based programs and ideas around how we can move forward.
Excellent. There's the mention in when I was speaking with George earlier in the week, there was the mention of the need for a new narrative. I want to get to the questions that we have, but just can you just talk a little bit about that new narrative? Either one of you is fine.
Peter, why don't you take this?
Well, you're very eloquent on this point, George. Um,
Oh,
but
all
I
right.
think that
Whatever. Okay. Oh, all right. Well. I mean, there's in all political and religious transformations, successful ones throughout world history, they've been accompanied by a strong and simple story, a story which tells us who we are, where we are, why we are there, how we're going to get out of it, and where we're going to end up. And they've all deployed, and this seems to be a very strong rule in political transformation, a particular narrative structure that we call the restoration story. And it goes like this. The land has been thrown into disorder by powerful and nefarious forces working against the interests of humankind. But the hero or heroes will stand against those forces, against the odds, overthrow them, and restore harmony to the land. That's the basic structure. And you will have seen this 100 times in the New Testament, in Harry Potter, in Lord of the Rings. It's a very familiar narrative structure, and it's one that's been used to great effect by politicians across the ages, whether they're Marxists, whether they're Keynesians, whether they're Nazis. Donald Trump, the MAGA movement, has used this exact structure, and so did the neoliberals very effectively. And one of the things which has been so missing from a counter politics has been a simple, coherent narrative. And we saw just how badly that was missing when neoliberalism collapsed in 2008 with the financial crisis, which was directly caused by the deregulation of the finance sector, which was a fundamental neoliberal demand. So you would have thought, right, that's the moment we finish it off. But you can't finish it off unless you have a new story with which to replace it, because the human brain is attuned to stories, and the only thing that can replace a story is a story. And in 2008, this golden opportunity came to overthrow it, to replace it with something much better, but we had no story at all. And some people said, well, maybe we need a little bit less neoliberalism. And some people said, well, maybe we need to go back to Keynesianism. You can't go back in politics unless you're a fascist. Fascists are very good at going back. They can constantly reinvent fascism, but everything else much, much harder. You need to come up with a new story. And so that's one of the things that Peter and I have tried to do in the book, is to produce a new, short, coherent story of what that change is going to look like, how the heroes, us, the working and middle classes, are going to overthrow the powerful and nefarious forces of neoliberalism and now of the radical right, Donald Trump and the rest, and restore harmony to the land.
Ah, beautiful. Let's dig right into these questions now. Thank you both so much. Let's take this one from Lissa. Trump says he abhors globalists, quote unquote. What is the neoliberal view on globalism politically? We know financially they support free flow, quote unquote. Either of you?
So Trump is not a pure neoliberal by any means. Like all people on the far right, he's an opportunist, and he'll pick policies from lots of different doctrines which suit his narrative at any particular time. He's completely undiscriminating. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about anything. The idea of having a consistent ideology has never been one of his aims, and so he will take some elements of neoliberalism, particularly cutting of state programs, destroying departments, ripping down state spending, cutting taxes for the very rich. All that is totally neoliberal, as is his destruction of regulations, of public protections. That's neoliberalism. But his trade wars are absolutely not neoliberalism. Neoliberalism and globalism were very closely related. One of the aspects of neoliberalism was to pull down capital controls and foreign exchange controls and create a smooth flow of trade in goods and services around the world with harmonized global standards. So you can sell exactly the same thing everywhere, which from one point of view makes a lot of sense. But what it means is that a single global corporation can come to dominate the trade in a particular good or service in every nation on earth, and that's what we're seeing, particularly with the tech companies. Now, Trump is using trade wars basically as a means of distraction. We're going to beat up these other countries, so don't look too hard at what's going on in our own country. He can point the finger elsewhere. This is what the far right always does. It's all about scapegoating. It's all about distraction. So those Canadians, they're the problem. Those Mexicans, those Chinese, and the far right thrives on conflict. It needs conflict to be able to extend its reach. So it's contradictory ideologically. It's not contradictory in terms of just seeking raw power by any means possible.
Thank you. James asks, I liked your description of capitalism relying on boom, bust, quit, with examples of Madeira and Central America. How would you apply that concept of boom, bust, quit in our current epoch?
Very nice question. Why don't you take that, Peter?
Yeah, well, I think just touching on that when I was discussing this film, Devil Put the Coal on the Ground, which focuses on exactly what's happened in West Virginia. We've seen not just big energy go in, but it's the pharmaceutical corporations and the petrochemical companies. It's what really fascinated me about doing my research about West Virginia is that West Virginia is a state that was founded by 12 white businessmen. And in its original constitution, in its founding papers, it was very clear that that state was created for the sole purpose of the extraction of resources from West Virginia, which kind of blew my mind. But it's very transparent. It's very clear why West Virginia was formed and what it's there for. And that's exactly what they've done with it. They've absolutely destroyed the land, the water, the pollution and the is so bad in West Virginia as a result of the coal mining, the strip mining, the mountaintop removal, and all the really complicated and terribly poisonous process that's involved in that. You can't even, in most areas in West Virginia, you can't even eat what you grow. You can't eat the fish that you pull out of a stream or a river. You can't eat the deer that you've shot, in the hills behind your house. And what's so just soul punishing about this is that there's a cultural tradition of self-sufficiency in connection to the land in West Virginia that has just been ripped out from underneath people, right? Like if nothing else, you could grow your own vegetables and you could hunt and you could fish, you know, and there was this sort of pioneering, self-sufficiency, approach to life that you'd be fine, you could take care of yourself. You can't do that anymore, right? And so we've seen, you know, it's remarkable to drive through some parts of West Virginia and just see entire mountains just ripped, the tops are ripped off. That, and you literally can see, the toxins flowing down the rivers. And these people, the resources have been extracted, the people have been used up and spit out the other end when they're no longer useful. Um, and then, and then of course you've had the pharmaceutical companies who've come in, and when these people are at their most vulnerable, they've they have dumped millions of pills of, millions of prescriptions of OxyContin into this community, right? So you get these vulnerable people that then become hooked on these on Oxy, right? And they're vulnerable because of the injuries that are due to work, these terribly difficult physical working conditions in the mines and elsewhere, and and are reeling also from this sort of cultural dislocation, right? Again, it comes back to this belonging and meaning, right? We all need meaning in our lives. And so you see this exact process of boom, bust, and quit all throughout the United States in these different pockets. And West Virginia is this test case. You see these incredible photos of what these towns in West Virginia were like in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, there were these vibrant main streets with like 3 movie theaters and restaurants and bustling Main Street. It looked like, this sort of these images that you would see out of a film from the 50s or 60s that exemplified why the American spirit was so wonderful. Now you look at these main streets and there's nothing. It's a ghost town. It's boarded up. And I've spent a lot of time down in West Virginia and witnessed this firsthand. Um, it's towns with, um, just drug houses and boarded up buildings, and all the businesses are gone. And and I think, I mean, I would recommend watching Devil Put the Coal in the Ground if you want a real life American example of how this happens and how it's happening right now.
Tragic. Um, okay. Fred asks something that actually piggybacks on what you were just exposing there, Peter. George, you've researched and written a lot about our impacts on the environment, and I'm very curious to hear how neoliberalism has influenced our environmental damage.
Yes. So it's been the worst possible doctrine at the worst possible time. Just as we become aware of the huge extent of our environmental crisis and the ability of climate breakdown to basically render the planet uninhabitable to most of its people, we have a dominant political doctrine which says states should not interfere. If businesses are doing something, that's a good thing, and they should just be left to get on with it, even if that thing that they're getting on with is actually destroying our life support systems. That's innately a good thing because it is being done by business. That's the neoliberal argument. And so you've got to strip away the regulations, strip away the public protections which defend people and planet from the ravages of capitalism. And even as the science has got stronger and stronger, the evidence has mounted, we see governments all over the world tearing down these essential environmental protections and allowing capital to seize more and more of the living world, just as Peter's described in West Virginia, grabbing whole mountain ranges, cutting the tops off, just ripping ripping them out of the ground like teeth. We're seeing this happening all over the world as government governments are lobbied by corporations saying we want to take everything, and the corporations are able to use neoliberalism as a justifying ideology to enable them to do that. And when governments succumb to neoliberal ideology, they tend to enable that to happen. And now, of course, we see Trump, who in some respects is pursuing a turbocharged neoliberalism, destroying entire environmental agencies in order to allow that to happen.
And one of the key components here is how this ties in with gross, right? And it, the limited resources that we have available on our planet. We talk about this in the film and the book that, you know, oftentimes it's common for economists to sort of look at 3% growth as being sort of healthy growth for any nation state or any economy. But when you when you if you are constantly operating at 3% annual growth, that means you're going to double every, is it 20 or 24 years, George?
It's every 24 years. It's
So right. So you're going to get a doubling of your growth every 24 years, right? And that's going to double again in another quarter century and double again in another quarter century. Now, it doesn't take, you know, a brilliant math minds to figure out what happens to a planet when the growth is when the growth has quadrupled over the course of a century. Like we can hardly, you know, we're already pushing beyond the boundaries of what the Earth can handle as it is. We talk about this in the book and the movie a lot about tipping points and where we are in terms of Earth systems being uh, irreversibly altered, right? And imagine if you take that growth and you just keep multiplying it and multiplying it and multiplying it. I mean, it's insane. It's absolute insanity what we are doing to ourselves. And thankfully, I think finally this idea of slow economic growth is at least being discussed. But neoliberalism doesn't care about that. Neoliberalism wants to speed it up even faster, right? Even though the greatest environmental minds are keenly aware that we got to slow growth down, like we are in trouble. The sirens are going off, the alarm bells are ringing. It's all around us. Los Angeles is burning, and now it's going to be like, and now there's mudslides, right? It doesn't end, right? And but what neoliberalism by definition does is accelerate all of that.
Okay, a question from Kathleen. At the end of the book, the authors call for citizen assemblies through an active civic engagement. But how can this happen if the majority of the people don't understand what they're voting for, having disengaged, and continue to cast votes against their own self-interest?
Peter, why don't you take that?
Well, I think that's precisely why we wrote the book. And I also think that's why we have this focus on the politics of belonging at the end of the book. The ways for us to take control of our lives is to make politics local again, to find different ways to have more control over our own lives through our own communities and through the economics of those communities. And there's lots of different ways to do that. I mean, George mentioned uh, both participatory democracy and participatory budgeting earlier, but you know, there's also all kinds of different ways that this idea of the commons is being revisited, and how these different uh, cultural and social resources can be harnessed by communities. Um, and and again, it's what we've seen time and time again through some of these experiments that have been that people have engaged with around the world is that the more people engage with something like participatory democracy or govern or budgeting, the more the more connected they feel to their community, the more engaged they feel with one another, the more they get to know their neighbors, the more they feel like they have control over their lives. And a piece of this is also educating one another. Um, you know, we learn about one another and we learn about our community's needs, um, and one another's needs by engaging in community this way. And this is why politics of belonging is so crucial. And you know, Lucas and myself, we were so inspired by some of these ideas that George and I explored in the film, or in the book, and that George and I and Lucas explored in the film, that Lucas and I are working on basically a follow-up to this film that really focuses on all of those ideas, which there are myriad of exciting ideas out there. Everything from employee ownership of corporations to like worker-owned cooperatives to, you know, all kinds of interesting ideas around universal basic income, guaranteed employment, purpose-driven trusts, climate budgeting, true cost pricing. Again, like the expansion of the commons, really fascinating work being done there. And I think, yes, they're all being done on uh, kind of piecemeal in a way that's not connected yet. Um, but they're proven initiatives, they're proven policies that are working for people in isolation of one another. And just starting to connect these things, um, just being able to integrate two or three of these ideas and incorporate them into the way you work in your community will make a huge difference um, in terms of moving forward and finding not just the politics of belonging, but also developing an economy that benefits all of us a little better.
Excellent. Thank you. Uh, Naima says, she asks, where do people of African origins fit into this push to return to its racist past? Post-traumatic enslavement trauma is real.
Yes, I mean, it's what we're seeing in the US now, of course, is a resurgence of just blunt, brutal racism. And so much of what Trump is playing on is simply white supremacism, and just laying on yet another layer of cruelty and exploitation on top of many centuries of that witnessed in the United States and around the world. Um, and so, you know, we part of the response, a huge part of it has to be solidarity. You know, we will see ourselves picked off one by one group after another, if we don't support every group. You know, we're seeing what's happening to protesters in favor of Palestine at the moment. What's happening to Columbia University for having the temerity to have some people protest against genocide. We are seeing horrendous attacks on people of color, of um, uh, on trans people, on gay people, on everyone other than straight white males, with money behind them. Everybody else is in the firing line, and if we don't come together and we don't unite against these attacks, we will be next. Not immediately, maybe, but somewhere down the line, all of us are going to suffer for it. Hardly anyone benefits from fascism. A tiny number of people, but the billionaires and their concierges and a few sadists who enjoy beating people up and killing them, everybody else suffers from it.
And I
Anything
also,
to add to that, Peter? Yeah. Okay.
I just,
Go ahead.
I think we need to look at our own history as a cautionary tale as well. Um, Anyone who's familiar with union and labor organizing in the 20s, 30s, knows that race was used to divide the classes. I mean, there was clear class warfare happening at the time, and race was the wedge that was used to disempower the working class. And I think, we need to remind ourselves that this is about class, right? This is, we're engaged, rhetoric aside, to a certain extent, we're engaged in class warfare right now. I mean, and I could tell you who's winning, right? I mean, the oligarchs are clearly winning right now. Make no mistake about it. And I think, words like solidarity, we can't look at them as being kind of loaded terms. That it's what we have to do right now, right? We need to look beyond these divisions, these in many ways arbitrary divisions that are used to divide us from one another and from working together. And I think it's just it's I really caution people not to fall prey to that rhetoric that's been used to divide us in the past.
Excellent. We are almost out of time. There are many excellent questions that have gone unanswered. We just didn't get to them. I would encourage you to come to the film on Sunday at 5 at the Latchis, and of course Peter will be there and Lucas will be there, and they can answer questions at the end. And I'd also encourage you to look at all the resources that have been put up in the chat. And I want to really thank Windham World Affairs for being in our presence. They do remarkable work for us. And especially thank you, George and Peter. I
Thank you.
could
Thanks
talk
for
with
having
you
us.
for hours.
And just
Any
keep in
last
mind,
words?
keep in
Any
mind
last words? Yeah.
keep in mind that Georgia stayed up late for this. Over what time is it over there in the UK right now?
It's 10 p.m. It's not so bad, but yeah.
Okay, not so bad. Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Daylight
Any
saving. There we go.
any closing words, Susan? We have a minute.
Am I on? Am I here?
You're
Yeah,
there.
you are.
You're here.
The closing words. You can purchase this book, of course, at Everyone's Books in downtown Brattleboro. They will be at the film tomorrow, selling the books that Peter would be happy to sign. And for those not in Brattleboro, bookshop.org is your alternative to Amazon. So please use bookshop.org.
I assure you that Jeff Bezos does not need the money.
That's for sure. And I was just wondering if we did have another minute or two, if you guys just wanted to scroll through real quick. As Annie said, there's some unbelievable questions that we didn't get to. If you just wanted to pick one or two that are in your
The truth is, Susan, I need to go to bed, so I'm sorry. Much as I would love to.
Thank you for
Much
your
as I'd love to.
honesty.
But I'll be in Brattleboro on Sunday, and we'll stay
We'll
as long as
continue
we
to.
want to answer questions. So
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you,
you,
George.
George.
Thank you, everyone, for
Take
having us.
care. Cheers.
Great
Bye-bye.
weekend.